Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Professor William Jacobson joins Freedom to Learn today to discuss the Legal Insurrection Foundation and Defense of Freedom Institute's new report, Intersectionality, the Rise of a Dangerous Anti-American Ideology and How to Stop It. Professor Jacobson explains how intersectionality is the driving ideology behind DEI, CRT, anti-Americanism, and campus anti-Semitism. He explains how intersectionality moved from higher education into K-12 classrooms. We talk about the role of teachers' unions and colleges of education, and the rise of destabilizing and violent activist movements like the Turtle Island Liberation Front. Professor Jacobson also lays out a proposal for a new executive order and federal guidance explicitly addressing intersectionality as part of existing anti-DEI efforts, along with legal, administrative, and congressional actions that he believes are necessary to push back against discriminatory practices in education. William A. Jacobson is the founder of Legal Insurrection and the Legal Insurrection Foundation. He's a clinical professor of law and director of the Securities Law Clinic at Cornell Law School. Professor Bill Jacobson, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me on.
Our organizations, the Legal Insurrection Foundation and the Defense of Freedom Institute, released a report called Intersectionality, the Rise of a Dangerous Anti-American Ideology and How to Stop It. So this report traces the development and application of intersectionality. What is intersectionality?
Well, intersectionality is a word that's been thrown around for a while, but most people don't understand. It is in many ways the mother's milk of critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So intersectionality was actually developed as a fairly benign employment law doctrine in the late 1980s by the same woman who coined the phrase critical race theory. What it says is how it originally developed in employment law is that focusing on Black women, they have two intersecting identities, female and racial, that could have multiple forms of discrimination. So as an employment doctrine, it made sense, but it has morphed into an identity doctrine, a group identity doctrine, where everybody is viewed and everybody is judged based on their group identity. And so intersectionality gave rise to critical race theory, gave rise to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I teach on a campus. Intersectionality is the dominant ideology. People don't use that frequently, the term critical race theory, although it's used. They do use diversity, equity, and inclusion, although they've run away from it. But intersectionality is the dominant doctrine on college campuses. I see that firsthand. And it is untouched by a lot of the pushback against critical race theory and DEI that we see, because people don't understand what the origin of those doctrines and those practices are.
So the report describes intersectionality as dividing people into marginalized or privileged categories and saying that they're entitled to different treatment. That sounds a lot like CRT. And is that because, like you said, it's the mother's milk? It fed this CRT system?
Yes, group identity is the campus focus, and it manifests itself in critical race theory, which is a toxic term now they never like to use, but most practically in diversity, equity, and inclusion, where everybody is assigned a group identity. And those group identities are then used to build coalitions. That's where we get into the anti-Americanism, the anti-Westernism, the anti-Semitism that we see on the campuses, because they view everything as people of color versus white oppressor. And that is the dominant narrative. That is an intersectionality narrative that then manifests itself in other ways. And that's why they consider the United States illegitimate, because it is a white oppressor society, and coalitions of color, they refer to it, need to fight back against that. And so it is, the poison running through the veins of the higher ed system, and increasingly K through 12, which is everybody identifies not the way our Constitution says you should identify, which is an individual, endowed by your creator with certain inalienable rights. No, you're a member of a group. And it's essentially the balkanization of our society and the forming of coalitions along group identity. And that's why it's so dangerous. And that's why it's given rise to these other practices.
Well, I want to dig into two things that you said there. One, what's happening in K-12 specifically, and then why is it so dangerous? I wonder if we've been hearing the terms DEI and CRT for so long that we're getting a little numb to them. And we can't, according to what you've said in this report and what your organization is arguing for. So where are the dangers in this?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a perfect example, which is a teacher we brought forward on my website multiple years ago. A white teacher in an almost entirely non-white school district, Providence, Rhode Island. And she got along with the students great for 20 years. Then they switched the curriculum. This is K through 12. They switched the curriculum and brought in the CRT DEI curriculum. And they literally threw out the classic books on the shelves. Kind of creepy. They came through the classrooms and pulled them out and threw them into dumpsters and substituted essentially propaganda pamphlets along CRT lines, white oppressor versus non-white oppressed. And she described how in just the course of a year or two, the students turned against her. And most importantly, the students turned against their country. In Rhode Island, they're required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, any student doesn't have to. They have a constitutional right not to. But the class needs to do it. And they stopped standing for the Pledge of Allegiance and stopped reciting it. And they started to refer to her as America. You're America because you're white. We're not America because we're not white. And that's the danger. And that's why we're trying to call attention to this. That's why we're sounding the alarm. People don't understand that these practices that turn students against their country emanate from an ideological view that you're a member of a racial or ethnic group. You're not a member of the United States. And what they do is they turn students against each other, they turn students against their teachers, and they turn students against our country. And you see it on the streets almost every day now in the news, how that has happened. And that's why we view this as a very particularly dangerous ideology, because it's attacking our system. Another example I give you, which is mostly, I believe, in higher ed, it might be in K through 12, which is land acknowledgments. At Cornell, every official event needs to start off with a fairly lengthy land acknowledgement.
That's still happening?
That's still happening, absolutely. And I can sum up the land acknowledgement very quickly, although they don't say it this bluntly. We're an illegitimate country. We're on stolen land. We have no right to be a country. I mean, that's what it is. And every official event needs to start with that. And the way I would say, focusing on K through 12, this all started on the campuses, but it has moved into K through 12 because we've graduated one, maybe two generations of students who are steeped in this ideology. And particularly the teachers' unions are a problem. We do a lot of work both in K through 12 and higher ed, although mostly my organizations are focused on higher ed. But every place we go in K through 12, we bump up against the teachers' unions. Mm-hmm. They push this ideology. They use their political power to make sure it sticks. They are the driving force. And K through 12, we're increasingly seeing this ideology. Now, the good news is also the bad news. The good news is there is substantial and meaningful pushback in red states, because education at K through 12 still is mostly directed at the state and local level. But in the blue states, it's actually getting worse. In Rhode Island, in New York State, it's actually getting worse. And so it's deeply in K through 12, and it's very troubling, like the example I gave you. And we've documented it, and she's spoken publicly about her experiences in the system. It is really poisoning students against their country. And that's why you see the rise of groups like Antifa. You see the rise of groups who may not speak in racial terms, but are taught to hate our country. And one of the examples in the report is the Turtle Island Liberation Front. Turtle Island I don't know. Have you ever heard of Turtle Island?
I've heard of it recently, both because that organization started getting some attention.
Yeah.
Another report that DFI put out,
Yeah.
graduate student unions, and they like to use that term,
Well,
turtle island.
congratulations. You're one of the few people off a campus who's actually heard of it. Anybody who's on a campus knows exactly what Turtle Island is. It's connected to the land acknowledgments. Turtle Island is a Native American term, and there's some dispute how much it was used, but the activists have seized on it. Turtle Island is what they call the landmass we call the United States and North America. They do not recognize the United States as a legitimate entity. It is Turtle Island. It is getting back to the mythical Native American indigenous conception of this landmass. And so Turtle Island Liberation Front is in many ways the classic intersectional group. And Turtle Island Liberation Front is in the news because they were recently, or many of them were recently arrested by the federal government for plotting various crimes and carrying out apparently various crimes.
When you say crimes, violent crimes.
Violent crimes, yes. Not thought crimes, actual crimes, violating the planning to blow things up, things like that. And in fact, the Turtle Island Liberation Front was one of the things that motivated us to bring forth this report, because we don't think the policy holders understand it. They kind of understand CRT, they kind of understand DEI, but they don't understand intersectionality. And intersectionality is driving the anti-Americanism in the streets we see, the anti-Americanism in the colleges, and increasingly K through 12. And it's actually the ideology that supports domestic terrorist groups. And that's why we issued the report, and we're very happy DFI was able to cooperate with us on that. I feel it was a good cooperation, and we're moving forward. And we're calling on specific actions to be taken.
Yeah, I definitely want to explore the specific actions. I want to talk a little bit more about this concept, though, to make sure folks understand just how pervasive it is and what's driving it. And one more thing on the Turtle Island Liberation Front, a number of their leaders identify as transgender. So in Washington, we tend to do things as bureaucrats, as policy wonks in silos. And so the folks who might be thinking we're doing the right thing on gender ideology might have no idea that with intersectionality, it all blends together and becomes this very powerful force. So we have to be aware that we can't do the typical Washington thing and tick off boxes of actions that we've taken on these separate topics, on DEI, on CRT, on gender ideology, when there's something that's weaving it together in such a pernicious way, with things leaving the campus and showing up in society, or leaving the campus and showing up in K-12. It doesn't just happen. It's not just that students, happen to walk by a protest and kind of caught the feels of intersectionality. I wonder if you have any thoughts on kind of what colleges of education are doing to train up these teachers and to unionize the teachers so that they then go and preach this when they show up on elementary and secondary campuses.
Yeah, the colleges and the programs that train people to become teachers are notoriously the most left-wing, the most quote-unquote woke programs there are. So they're training teachers to push these ideologies. And when the teachers get on the job, that's exactly what they do. And so the teachers' colleges, for want of a better word, are really a fundamental problem. The people who go into K through 12 education as teachers, a significant portion of them have been specifically trained in these ideologies, and they're backed by the teachers' unions. And so that's the problem in K through 12. This is very heavily teacher focused. There are many of the foundations that fund the K through 12 curriculum and the K through 12 push to racialize everything. They're all supporting this. I mean, it is absolutely astounding how much money they seem to have. It seems to be a bottomless pit of money, despite what the media says about all the right-wing groups who are getting all this dark money. In fact, it's just the opposite. We're constantly astounded, and we've been covering education at various levels for almost 20 years now. We're constantly astounded at how well financed even groups you've never heard of, groups who popped up yesterday, seem to have limitless funds from major foundations that would shock people. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund funds a lot of the anti-Israel movement in the U.S. and on campuses. You could run down a list of name brand large foundations which have been captured and which fund all this stuff. So it's really a problem. At the state level, they can make a difference. I think at the federal level, they can too, and they're trying. But people need to understand how deeply entrenched this is.
Right, and the anti-Semitism is another topic that we should cover and that the report covers. You give specific examples of union-driven curriculum and materials that's getting pushed out into the schools by the Massachusetts
Yep.
Teachers Association, for example. It seems like a lot of these unions have Educator for Palestine, kind of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist factions that are very powerful. Could you speak a little to that?
Yeah, and we've seen this. This is again something else that started on campus. We've seen a push through the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement for 20 years to purge anyone who is pro-Israel from academia, to boycott them. And that works out in various ways now in the K through 12 teachers unions. Massachusetts is perhaps the most notorious. That what we see constantly is institutional capture. People are very motivated. One thing I've noticed, not just on these issues, but other issues, people on the left are extraordinarily motivated. They make this their life. Their entire life becomes being an activist. People right of center is like, I've got other things to do. I've got a lot. I can't devote myself 100% of the time to fighting these people. But the people who are pushing this are absolutely motivated. They are possessed in many ways over years and years and years. And they eventually take over institutions. One of the first that I covered major was, the American Studies Association. This was in 2013 and 2014. The first major faculty organization to endorse the boycott of Israel in 2013. And they did it in classic ways. First, their members took over subcommittees. Then they took over committees. And then the committees proposed referendum. And then they packed the membership. They got people to join so that when it finally came to a vote, the people who joined with the existing activists were able to pass resolutions, and they were the only ones who voted. So approximately 20% of the membership voted to boycott Israel because nobody else cared. And now the institution's completely captured.
Is this what the long march through the institution?
March through institutions, absolutely. Very strategic. You take over the subcommittee, you take over the committee, you stock the membership with people who agree with you, and all of a sudden you've captured an entire organization by 20% of the vote, because most people don't bother to vote. So it was a majority of the people who voted, but so few people voted that they were able to pass it. Now it's a completely captured institution. Same with the American Association of University Professors, which once was the gold standard for academic freedom, has been completely captured by anti-Israel activists. The president, I think he's still president, but the president is a professor at Rutgers who's openly anti-Zionist and openly an activist, now leads the organization supposedly devoted to academic freedom, and caused the organization to scale back its opposition to systematic academic boycotts. For decades, they were opposed to that. All of a sudden, they get captured, and now they withdraw the opposition. So this is a real problem, and we need to understand that we're dealing with a system where the major institutions have been captured. The question is, how do you take them back? That's a different question, but they have been captured.
You're arguing that it's necessary to deal with intersectionality as a distinct ideology. Maybe we've been playing whack-a-mole as we've been trying to take the institutions back, again, with dealing with things in silos, dealing with the products of intersectionality rather than the ideology itself. So I think that folks in Washington, maybe in state capitals, would say, well, we're already targeting the kind of discrimination that you're talking about. We're already targeting this kind of ideology. How would you push back on that
Yeah. I mean, one
perspective?
of the things we're calling for is to close what amounts to a loophole.
Okay.
So, in the executive orders have been impactful, can't change the embedded system in a year, but they've been very impactful. And DEI and CRT at the college level, and to some extent on the K through 12 as distinct ideologies, are in the retreat. I mean, schools are rebranding. They're staying away from the language. I'm not sure they've really changed their attitudes,
Right.
but they are. But intersectionality has been untouched, and it's the same ideology. And so what we're calling on is the administration to close that loophole. Now, closing that loophole isn't a cure-all. It's not going to fix everything, but it will fix a lot of the problem. It will fix the practices that we've documented that are going on, which are very similar to the racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination that takes place under DEI, but it's under a different name, and it is really the source of it. And so we think it would be an extremely major step forward for the administration to close the intersectionality loophole, to make the existing executive orders more effective and more impactful, because it gets to the underlying ideology which still flourishes openly on campuses.
How do you see that loophole showing up in the executive order? So, okay, there have been these anti-DEI, anti-gender theory measures, the executive orders. What exactly is the loophole? Like, do you need the word intersectionality in an executive order, or is it something beyond
I
that?
think it would be helpful to have that. And that's one of the things that we're calling for, is a new executive order that makes clear that intersectionality in its various forms is included under the definition of DEI in the prior executive orders. So we're not seeking to redo 6 or
Okay.
12 executive orders, just to make clear that intersectionality falls under the prior executive orders addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that would have a tremendous impact, just like those executive orders, particularly as to grant funding,
Mm.
federal contracting, all of those things have been very impactful. But to make it more complete, more inclusive, that's the word they love. To make it more inclusive, we need to include intersectionality. And we think it will have a tremendous impact. And we're not overselling it. No one of these executive orders, no matter what you put in there, can solve everything. But they do have a huge impact, because what we're ultimately seeking to do is not just to stop the discriminatory practices that take place under the rubric of these ideologies, is to change the campus culture.
We've been focusing on executive orders, but you're asking for administrative guidance, like dear colleague letters to
Exactly.
address this
Once
too.
there's this executive order, Department of Education, Department of Justice, HHS, all of these different entities, we're hoping will then offer guidance to the people who get their money, as to that intersectionality is included under the prior guidance when it comes to DEI discrimination. And I think that will have a tremendous prophylactic impact, that people will get the message that we need to be careful here, and that we need to include the vast intersectional programming that takes place on campuses and in K through 12.
Who are the people that you want to get the message? Because the unions aren't going to get the message, aren't going to take any action. They're going to continue with the talking point of CRT, intersectionality. Those are legal theories that were constructed in the 80s, and they're not taught in classrooms. They'll just continue with that
Yeah.
talking point. So who are these executive orders? Who is the guidance targeted to? And who do you think will and can take action on this?
Well, it's essentially university administrators, university presidents, the ones who set the agenda, the ones
Okay.
who approve the programming, the ones who approve the academic offerings. They need to get the message that, just like they've been on notice about critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion, discriminatory practices, they need to also keep their focus on intersectionality. And what this is ultimately going to is to dismantling the DEI industrial complex that's on campuses. That industrial complexes included federal funding. I was shocked at how much of this was funded by the federal government, states funding, private philanthropy. The administrators at the universities need to understand that they are in a unique position to change the campus culture through the programming, and that if they want to continue to see the flow of federal dollars, they have to address the intersectionality problem.
Yeah, as a Board of Visitors member of a small university in Virginia, I guess I'd want to put board members on that
Yep.
list as well. I think we kind of float, maybe, I don't want to say above this. We float in this like kind of other world of not really realizing the level of control these kinds of ideologies have an impact on the campus. And so I would say that trustees need
Yes.
to wake up. Yeah, when you talk about the level of federal funding, that's actually one of the recommendations in the report as well, like directing federal funding only towards projects and programs that produce meritorious research and education in the national interest. Like, stop funding this garbage. And you point out the fiscal year 2026 presidential budget request, but it showed up in the FY27 budget request too. They propose to stop funding this stuff. Who needs to really wake up on this? I would say Congress needs to. The administration knows what's going on, but Congress likes to just shell out funds without thinking this through.
Yeah, well, Congress, Republicans in the Congress need to make sure that there aren't specific provisions funding these things.
Yeah.
Because that's what
Earmarks and
you run
whatnot.
into a court fight over, is when the administration refuses to spend money that has been specifically targeted by Congress. So Congress doesn't need to do anything negative. They don't need to say, don't fund something. I mean, that would be great if it happened, but it's probably not going to happen. But they need to scrutinize these bills that come through and make sure that there's no targeted money for these intersectional CRT, DEI, racialized programs. The administration, though, still has discretion on how things are handed out and what they are. And that's why I think the departmental level would become very important, because they're much closer to the issue than the White House is. But a push from the White House to identify intersectionality as part of the problem, I think, would go a long way towards encouraging the departments to issue their own guidance. And you're right. I think one of the most wrongly ignored components of this are boards of trustees, boards of visitors. They actually are ultimately responsible for the university, and they get very little attention in this whole equation. And maybe I'm guilty of that too. I focus on the presidents and I focus on, the deans and things like that.
Yeah.
But actually,
But if they're captured, that's harder.
But getting the boards of trustees more involved, I know it's difficult, but I think that's important, because they ultimately are responsible for the university.
Well, Bill, I suggest that your team kind of swing by the annual gathering of the organization that trains up the board members, because it's very much a resist mentality there, and they want to continue on with the kind of things that you're saying are deeply unhealthy. So if if the board members are getting trained up and encouraged to embrace intersectionality, then we've got a problem. And I would say we do have a problem. Okay, lawsuits, definitely another tool, and one that you recommend as a way of dealing with this. So lawsuits against discriminatory practices arising from these policies premised on intersectionality. What can lawsuits do? And do you have some examples of success to point to on that front?
Well, my organization, Legal Insurrection Foundation, has a project called the Equal Protection Project, equalprotect.org. And we've worked mostly through administrative remedies, because we're talking about practices here that violate the Civil Rights Act. And that's what we're always clear. We've never challenged a program merely because it was DEI. But most of these practices, and it's the practices that the administration has addressed, most of these practices are in fact unlawful discrimination in violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For public universities, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, Equal Protection Clause, and it almost always violates state law. And in every single case we've brought, it also violates the school's own non-discrimination policies. So holding them to their own set of rules is extremely important. And we've had very good success. We've challenged, I think it's approaching 300 universities and colleges regarding over 800 programs. And in several hundred of them, we've seen the programs reworked. Now, are they doing it behind closed doors, what they're not doing openly? That's something that needs to be considered. I mean, and that's a huge issue with the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision, which is, are they actually following it, the colleges? So that's always a problem. But the administrative remedy is extremely important. And we had great success even under the Biden administration at the Department of Education because we challenged practices that are on their face discriminatory. They opened an investigation, still waiting for it to be resolved. The Trump administration did into practices at the Ithaca City School District, where they had events where white students were excluded. They literally had on the website an explanation as to why white students could not attend. We challenged a teacher hiring program in the Providence Public School District, which now the Department of Justice has. We filed first with the EEOC, worked it through the system, and now the Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit. And we've brought many actions. We challenged practices in the Cal State system at 8 of their campuses where there were certain practices only open to Black males. They've since revised those. We challenged 51 scholarships at the University of Rhode Island, which have now been taken down and under reconsideration because they had discriminatory terms. So we've done this in a lot of places. We've done it in red states, even red states that have banned DEI. We have found some programs and challenged them. University of Tennessee, I think we found. Knoxville, we found a program. And so this is all over the place. It's an all hands on deck situation. We are challenging in court a New York State funded program called the STEP Act, Science Technology Entry Program, where the state provides funds to 56 colleges and universities to provide STEM programming for high school and middle schoolers. So far, great. The problem is the eligibility requirements were discriminatory. If you were Black, Hispanic, or Native American as a student, you were automatically eligible. But if you weren't, i.e., white or Asian, you had to show family economic hardship. That's now in court. We've survived a motion to dismiss. I believe we will win. Nothing's ever 100%, but we should win. It's a pretty open and shut case. But this is what we're seeing. We're focusing increasingly more on state-funded programs since the federal government is not still funding this sort of discrimination. Although we did find 3 openly discriminatory programs at HHS, and we filed a complaint with HHS over that. It's like trying to get soap out of a sponge. Get this racism out of the system is hard. And so, legal actions, whether they're administrative or they're court, and we focused on administrative because we found it to be a very efficient remedy. Court cases are very expensive, can go on for years. Whereas if you have an administration that's doing its job, they can resolve these things quickly. And like I said, we even had success under the Biden administration, and we're hoping to have even more success under the Trump administration. We have a window of opportunity, which has about 2.5 years left in it, while a like-minded administration is running these agencies. The agencies need to get more aggressive on this, and they need to act on the complaints from us and DFI and other groups expeditiously, because we're all seeking the same goal, which is a non-discriminatory educational environment. The things we say we are for, the things every single school we've challenged says they are for, but they're just not doing it. And so I think lawsuits, administrative claims, all of the above.
Right. Congressional hearings. We don't want to totally let Congress off the hook here.
I hope we can get a congressional hearing or subcommittee hearing on the intersectionality issue, because that's part of the education process, national education process. Look at what the hearings regarding campus anti-Semitism did. Yeah. Really changed in many ways the trajectory of the education system in the nation. We want it all. We want executive orders, guidance from departments, funding more clearly targeted to things that are civic-minded as opposed to race-minded, and, of course, congressional hearings to shine a huge spotlight on the issue. So this report, I encourage people to read it. This report lays out many choices, and it's not one or the other. It's all of the above because the problem is so deeply embedded.
As we conclude, I love to have my guests tackle the myth that bothers them the most. So is there a myth about intersectionality that you'd want to tackle today?
Well, I think the biggest myth is that we are a systemically racist society. Maybe you could make that argument 100 years ago. Maybe you could make it 70 years ago. You cannot make it in 2026. In fact, what we see everywhere is over the top, sometimes unlawful efforts to make sure we are not discriminatory. There is no embedded discriminatory agenda in our country. Unfortunately, the fight against discrimination has led to a form of discrimination. And so that is the biggest myth I see, is that we are systemically racist. But in terms of countries that have diverse populations, we are probably the least racist in the world. It is not systemic. And really, to the extent there is systemic racism in the education system, it's the DEI and the CRT and the intersectionality that are pushing it. SPLC may be the best example. It was so hard for them to find actual racism. The government alleges they created it and they funded it. And so that's the biggest myth, is that we're a systemically racist society. It's an insult to our society, and it's an insult to students because it sends the message that because of the color of your skin, you might as well just give up. And that's a really damaging sort of message. So that's my message: is we are not a systemically racist country. We're just the opposite. We go to enormous lengths to prevent racism in this country, and that should be recognized and celebrated.
How can people follow the Legal Insurrection Foundation's work?
Sure. Well, we have multiple websites. So legalinsurrectionfoundation.org is the foundation's website. We're better known from our blog, legalinsurrection.com, which has been around since 2008, and the Equal Protection Project, which is equalprotect.org.
Well, Professor Jacobson, thank you for your commitment to free speech, to academic freedom, to our country, and thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me on.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.